Okay, welcome back. This is Dr. E. Continuing our lessons on evolution. In our last lesson, we talked about natural selection, a process by which heritable traits become more or less common in a population of a life form due to the effect of that trait on the differential survival success of an organism as it interacts with its environment. Before going on to our next topic, let me add that the term natural selection should be considered in contrast to artificial selection. That is, artificial selection is what we might think of as breeding of animals or cross-pollinating of plants, where humans were involved in trying to select for traits for a plant or an animal. Whereas in natural selection, it's nature itself that is the driving force essentially for the selection of these traits. And so it is in that sense that Darwin came up with the term natural selection in contrast to artificial selection. Now in this lesson, we're going to talk about the real big question. How did life begin? And we will see that there are many remaining questions about how life began. There are really three general ideas to explain the origin of life. One is called abiogenesis, which we'll define in a minute. The others are panspermia, which is the idea that life came to planet Earth from outer space. I'm not going to talk about this idea because basically it's kicking the can down the road. That is, then you would have to ask the question, how did life begin somewhere else? And of course, explanations can involve things beyond science. It's things we do on Sunday morning. And while our intent here is not to challenge any personal beliefs, what we want to present here is some ideas about how life may have originated. So let's go back to abiogenesis, which is this hypothesis that life could have arisen spontaneously from a non-living world, what we call an inorganic world. Go back again to 3.5 to 4 billion years ago. The Earth was a very hostile environment. It was hot. The temperature was above the boiling point of water for the first 500 million years or so. We call this the Hadean, for Hades, Hadean eon. There was a bombardment of meteorites. The atmosphere was pretty noxious. It contained ammonia and hydrogen sulfide, as well as some other gases, carbon dioxide, water vapor, nitrogen, hydrogen, and methane. But importantly, as we described earlier, there was no oxygen gas or very little oxygen gas in the environment. So it wasn't what we would think is necessarily conducive to life. Well, an interesting experiment was done a number of years ago by scientists named Miller and Urey, where they demonstrated that small molecules, what we call biomolecules, those molecules we find in living systems, such as amino acids and small lipids and sugars, can be made by an electrical spark in a mixture of the above gases. So in this next slide, we'll sort of summarize the Miller-Urey experiment. So they had an apparatus shown on the left where they had a mixture of gases, and they would introduce an electric shock or a spark discharge into this mixture of gases containing water vapor and ammonia and methane and hydrogen gas. And they did this for a number of days, and they found that if they then collected the product that was formed, they found that they had actually produced 11 out of the 20 common amino acids during this experiment, and also some simple sugars. The point of this experiment is that biological molecules could be produced from non-biological molecules through a spark discharge. So this supports the theory of a primordial soup idea, that if there are a mixture of chemicals necessary for life, that life at least had an environment where it could spontaneously have been created. And there are other ideas about the origin of life that have some basis. One is that maybe early life originated with RNA being the dominant nucleic acid. Of course, now we know that RNA is sort of a helper molecule with DNA, and DNA is the storage molecule, the information storage molecule in our cells. But RNA can also store genetic information, and importantly, RNA, ribonucleic acid, has catalytic activity. It can catalyze certain reactions, including the breaking of peptide bonds. Now, RNA is more fragile of a molecule than DNA, and there would still be the remaining question, well, then how did this first RNA molecule, which is a pretty complicated molecule, how did it arise? Other ideas are that life was created in an environment of clay. That clay, natural dirt, clay, somehow can act as a catalyst and also can organize molecules. The hypothesis is that these organic molecules became trapped or absorbed into the clay, and that the molecules then underwent catalyzed reactions to form larger molecules, including maybe the above-mentioned ribonucleic acid, or RNA. There's also the idea that metabolism, metabolic reactions, sort of came first, and then enzymes evolved to speed up these reactions, and then the blueprints, the genetic information, were added later. So this hypothesis is that small organic molecules, again becoming trapped, perhaps in oily membrane regions, developed energy harnessing sets of reactions, and that these were somehow became catalyzed to be fast enough, and then became organized and were able to reproduce in some way. So these are some ideas, logical ideas of how life may have been created, but they still lead to a large number of open-ended questions. How can we account for the universality of the genetic code? Remember that we described a genetic code that is used by DNA, and there are many, many possible versions of the genetic code, but all life forms appear to use more or less the same genetic code. How do we explain the existence of 20 common amino acids when there can be a variety of other amino acids? Why just these 20? How can we explain the chirality features? Remember, that's the left and right-handed nature of biomolecules, with amino acids being L or left-handed and simple sugars being D or right-handed. Also, how do we account for the common metabolic pathways? We may have talked about glycolysis and what is called the Krebs cycle, and these pathways are used in all life forms with only some slight variations. And of course, we also have the fossil record, the evidence for vestigial organs, adapted organs, evidence of speciations, extinctions, etc. So there's a lot of evidence, but in some ways, these are all like pieces to a puzzle about evolution and about the origin of life. And while some of the things make a whole lot of sense, the key question is, where did that first piece come from? And I think that some scientists will favor some explanations and have particular ideas, but I think that most scientists would agree that this is a large remaining question, and that one can speculate. But the questions are so large that that we really don't have a universal explanation at this point. Now we'll pause now to take a quiz, and then we'll have one final lesson in this chapter on evolution.